All right, I think we might start officially then. Kia ora koutou, ngā nui ki a tātou katoa. My name's Helen Fitt and I'm a board member of ITSNZ, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all here today. It's great to see you here, and I know that we're in for an absolute treat from our speaker today. Professor Benjamin Sovacool has a whole stack of accolades to his name, including the 2019 ITSNZ Prize for his work on social justice in an era of climate change and energy scarcity, and the Dedication to Justice Award given by the American Bar Association. He currently holds positions at the University of Sussex in the UK and at Aarhus University in Denmark. His research has been endorsed by presidents, prime ministers, and Nobel laureates, and he is one of the most highly cited global researchers in the field of controversies in energy and climate policy. Having read several of his papers, and actually last week submitted one of my own that will add to his already impressive citation count, I am absolutely delighted that Professor Sovacool accepted our invitation to speak today. Today's presentation will be about 40 minutes long, and then there will be an opportunity for questions. If you look at the menu bar at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A option. So to ask a question, please just click on the Q&A option and type in what you'd like to ask. You can do that at any point during the presentation, and we will come back to questions at the end. For now, though, to guide us all through the possibilities of vehicle-to-grid and socio-technical transitions beyond electric mobility, I am absolutely delighted to hand over to Professor Benjamin Sovacool.
Wow, Helen, what a fantastic introduction. You should do my introductions everywhere. I think that would be excellent. Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. You can hopefully see my really green-blue slide properly. All right, fantastic. So I'm really privileged to present today on this topic of vehicle-to-grid. Helen chose the topic, so if you don't like it, you can send complaints to her. You can see this really weird icon on the upper left, which is the Danish spelling of the Danish Council for Independent Research. I won't even try to pronounce it, but I'm very lucky that we had a 3-year project of more than $1.5 million where we rigorously investigated vehicle-to-grid. And I'll tell you about that project in a moment. But first, I should say, Newton said he stands on the shoulders of giants, and this project really benefited from a fantastic team. So it wasn't just me. And if you notice, many of the papers I'm going to talk about, actually very few of them have only one author. So I really do want to acknowledge and thank Lance, Noel, Johannes Kester, and Gerardo were the primary research fellows. And then Xiaolin we were lucky enough to have her for the first year of the project and for a lot of the original primary collection. So really, the project benefited from their hard work. They're the ones who did most of the data collection, the interviews, the focus groups, visiting car dealerships, etc. So yeah. Also, I'm used to talking to a lot of Americans, and I often find it's good to tell them where the Nordic region is. I remember when I moved to Denmark, one of my family members said, "I really hope you enjoy Amsterdam." And I said, "That's very nice, but it's nowhere in the Nordic region." So the Nordic region is indeed 5 countries. It's Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. Greenland is not here, even though it's technically part of the Kingdom of Denmark, because for our project, Greenland has 40,000 people, and I think it had 3 electric vehicles. So it really wasn't a primary focal point. We did limit our data collection to the 5 countries here. Why EVs and why vehicle to grid? Well, for most of you who've been paying attention, we need to urgently decarbonize the transport sector. And electric vehicles are probably one of the most promising options we've got for passenger mobility, especially if we want to keep doing mobility in a kind of regime where we have private cars. Then EVs are also very compatible with our lifestyles. And what you can see here, I think there are 3 things that kind of jump out. The first is just the sheer scale at which total EV penetration is accelerating rapidly. I mean, just look at these growth rates. And to put it into perspective, it took something like 9 years for the first 1 million battery electric vehicles to be sold. It took a little more than a year for the second million. It took less than a year for the third million, 9 months for the fourth million, and 6 months for the fifth million. So in huge, economies of scale are being created and huge deployment periods and patterns. Second thing to notice here is the red color, and that is that the world's largest market for EVs is indeed China. By far, it is China. Something like 80% of the world's EVs are in China. So they really are driving a lot of that growth. And while we did do some research on China, we did not do research for most of the project in China. Our grant was a Nordic grant focused on the 5 Nordic countries. But that does bring me to my third point. After China and the United States, the Nordic region is the 3rd largest market for EVs. And in here, you can see that the purple line in the graph is Europe, but much of that is actually Sweden, Norway, and a little bit of Finland, Iceland, and Denmark. So we were still picking a very big market. And when you don't talk about absolute numbers, and instead you talk about percentage numbers, Norway is by far the world leader for EVs. 60% of new vehicle sales per year, per capita rates that are 20 times higher than China, as well as points and points ahead of any other country in Europe for their uptake of battery electric vehicles. So we got to benefit from studying a world leader in electric mobility at the very time they were becoming the world leader. This also just kind of gives you a little bit of why the Nordic region is important. Unlike many regimes like perhaps India or China or Brazil or Russia, you have very aggressive climate and energy policies in the Nordic region. They have some of the most ambitious zero carbon energy plans to be low carbon by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2040 to 2050, depending on which country. And they also have very, very robust targets to decarbonize transport. So this slide comes from the International Energy Agency, hardly known to be, radically enthusiastic about renewables or EVs. And you can see here they're telling you what transport use will likely be like in 2050. In petajoules. And everywhere you see purple is electrification. Of course, it's of rail and of trucks, but it is especially of PLDVs. You have to love the IEA because a PLDV is a fancy way of a car, personal light duty vehicle. Why didn't they just say car? I don't know. But you are expected to see pretty large distribution of electric vehicles to the point where about 2/3 of car sales are expected to be EVs by 2040. And already you see, as I said, Norway leading the way. So we embarked on this project, not very clever with the name, kind of, it's named what it was, Nordic Vehicle to Grid. Even the acronym we probably could have gotten better. It's just NV to G. And we were allowed to ask one research question in the proposal, and we kind of cheated and asked 3, even though they're framed as one question. But really it was, what are the benefits of a potential vehicle to grid transition? What are its likely barriers and obstacles and impediments? And what policies can help minimize the barriers and maximize the benefits? And by vehicle to grid, we're really drawing here on the work of Willett Kempton, who kind of argues this is just the ability to configure a vehicle so that it can sell power back to the grid, either bidirectionally or unidirectionally. Basically, your car becomes a self-contained energy resource, a form of distributed energy storage, or a form of grid services. And the kind of crux of V2G, the reason it's kind of neat and exciting, or at least it was, I think rests on 4 reasons. The first is, if I was with you in person, this is where I would ask you to raise your hand if you owned a car. And then I would say, okay, where's your car? And most of you, hopefully all of you would say it's somewhere else. Hopefully you wouldn't be driving in the middle of a seminar or a lecture. And that reminds us that most of the time, these really expensive vehicles that we buy are not used. I think the average vehicle is used 11 to 9% of the time. So 90% of the time, this very expensive asset is sitting idle. It's idle while you sleep. It's idle in a parking lot. It's idle while you work, unless you're in a car sharing regime. And these things are expensive. After usually housing and maybe a university education, a car is like the 3rd most expensive thing most people buy. Secondly, these cars have within them batteries. And what's very interesting is the batteries are pretty large, right? It's not like a mobile phone where the battery is small. And if you look at the equivalent electrical capacity of these batteries, they really, really add up. We've done the calculation for the United States, for the United Kingdom, and for all 5 Nordic countries. And in all of those situations, the equivalent battery size is greater than the grid. So in very simple terms, you could put all the electrical energy from the national grid into the car batteries if they were capable of storing energy at the same time. So that's the second thing. The third one is that for now, and I say for now because prices change based on fuel availability, based on demand, electricity is far, far cheaper than oil or petrol or even ethanol in terms of driving. Now that may change in a future world in 2050 if we all have EVs and electricity prices are really high. But for now, it's like 1/10 the cost if you go electric and you simply look at fuel costs. The final thing that's really weird, and this one took me a time to learn, is that you don't actually need a lot of new infrastructure if you're going to go vehicle to grid. And this is because the way that the grids are built, especially in the United States, I don't know about New Zealand's peak, but the United States has a huge summer peak based largely on air conditioning loads, which means they've got about 50 to 100 power plants that operate only a few days or weeks out of the year. So we have a lot of idle electricity capacity. And in the United States, the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory estimated, get this, 87% of vehicles could be fueled with electricity without building a single new power plant. If you simply better used and optimized the power plants that you had, especially capacity that was idle or not used or ramped down or was only used for peaking, which means counterintuitively, going vehicle to grid doesn't even mean you got to build new infrastructure. You just use the infrastructure you've got far more efficiently, and that helps everyone. It helps utilities pay off their power plants, improve their debt to equity ratios, and it also helps consumers because you don't have to build new sources of energy supply. And electricity is already a network that's in most homes, so you can just plug into the wall or the garage rather than say things like hydrogen, or biofuel, which may need entirely new distribution networks. So that's the kind of case for V2G, and this is why in 2015, when we did the proposal, we were so excited about it, because these 4 things make a compelling case, in theory, to the value of vehicle to grid. So we embarked on this project, and it was a social science project, and that just meant we first started with a lot of data collection. Like I said, we had $1.5 million. We spent about $1 million on data, and that included, very much intentionally, a mixed methods qualitative research design. So I realize this slide violates like every single rule about PowerPoint. Apologies for that. But basically, we did more than 250 expert interviews with a lot of stakeholders. We did expert interviews with people in transport, energy, tech companies, regulators, government, civil society, academia. And this resulted alone in about 1 million words of text, because many of these interviews were actually quite long. I think the longest one was 5 hours. Shortest one was 20 minutes. Interviews get you the expert views. We also wanted to get public views. So we did run 8 focus groups in kind of a mix of urban and peri-urban and rural areas. Aarhus, Denmark, Bergen, Norway, Copenhagen, Denmark, Gothenburg, Sweden, Helsinki, Finland, Reykjavik, Iceland, Stockholm, Sweden, Tampere, Finland. And we do have a study about the focus groups because they're really fascinating, because it's kind of so they're a bit different than the interviews, because people kind of have group discussions and raise things that maybe don't come up in a one-on-one conversation. Because the focus groups only had a few dozen participants, we wanted a mechanism to get broader views. So we ran a survey, and a pretty good one, nationally representative survey of about 5,067 respondents across all 5 of the Nordic countries. This survey was long, had 44 questions, took about half an hour. And we've got pieces there looking at the demographics of the survey, as well as things like politics or income and space. In the survey, one of the reasons it was so long, we had this technique called a choice experiment. This is kind of where respondents can kind of play a game. Like we can say, okay, if you really want to think about an EV, what matters the most? Is it the cost? Is it its speed? Is it its range? Is it its color? And they would, based on that, go into a simulation where they make different optimization choices, and we would record and monitor those choices. And that experiment is a better way, because rather than kind of stated preferences, it's like revealed preferences. So it was a really nice complement to the interviews, the focus groups, and the survey, because those were stated preferences. Just for the heck of it, we did do a separate study. I'm not even going to talk about it, but we were interested in school children. And one of my research fellows, Johannes, had his partner who was a school teacher. So we took advantage of that, and we did run a small, short survey in 15 schools in Denmark and the Netherlands to see about child perceptions of mobility. And essentially, these perceptions are mixed, in case you were wondering. That children definitely prefer automobility, like they don't want to cycle, they don't want to walk, they don't want to take the bus, but at the same time, they're excited with things like Tesla and, of course, rocket cars. So that's kind of cool. We then did car dealer visits. This was kind of neat, a mystery shopping thing. I will talk about this later, where we were concerned that maybe car dealerships and franchises might be antagonistic or opposition to electric vehicles. So we did shadow visits. We did 128 visits to dealerships in all 5 Nordic countries. And I'll talk about those results because they're fascinating. And then finally, because Lance Noel was an engineer, we did a series of simulation scenarios and optimization models, and we also did a deep dive into V2G and VGI, VGI's vehicle grid integration standards. We looked at the ISO standards and standards for electric vehicle supply equipment, that's EVSE. And because we didn't want to only look at Europe, we actually looked at how those standards are being implemented in China, the United States, and Europe. So a really nice piece on standards that we got published in the Journal of Cleaner Production. All right, so that's the big picture of what we did. As if that wasn't enough, though, we then got carried away. Each member of the research team picked favorite areas. And we were able to then run, because we had so much data, and we spent so much money on data, we then wrote a series of very inductive articles. We did do a spin-off one in China, which I'm not going to talk about, but we were just kind of curious to see Chinese respondents versus Nordic respondents. We have some stuff on barriers, which I'll talk about. We have some stuff on policies, which I'll talk about. We have some stuff on frames, which I won't talk about. We have some stuff on justice, which I'll talk about. And then we did pieces on things like business models or range anxiety, which I won't mention, gender, which I will, and things like urban-rural dynamics. Are EVs only for the city? Or are they actually adaptable and usable in rough, rugged rural environments? And then, because we still weren't done, we did other things that were more social scientific. We looked at things like visions and narratives. We looked at notions of luxury and conspicuous consumption. We looked at innovation styles at automotive manufacturers. We looked at what's been called the societal embedding of automobility with historical cases of the Netherlands and the US. And we did a little bit of work on users. And I will especially not talk about this, but we have 2 whole articles on theories and 2 state-of-the-art reviews on where the literature was when we began our project on vehicle to grid. So sorry to overwhelm you. Those are all the outputs. We then have this really nice final capstone book, kind of looks like a Star Wars cover for some reason. But yeah, called enticingly Vehicle to Grid, a socio-technical transition beyond mobility. This was written with all of us. And again, you can see it uses a different structure, uses different data that we hadn't used, talking all about basically the project. This is kind of everything in one place, published with Paul Grave. Okay, so with that aside, I thought rather than talk about 50 papers and all these methods, I'd focus my message very simply on a handful, only a handful of core findings. Less than 6, I think. And the first one of those is depressing. Start with the bad. Even though you saw those wonderful graphs a few minutes ago, showing you the rapid takeoff of Nordic electric mobility, showing you 60% of new car sales, even in these positive environments, there are still a host of barriers. The continued success of electric mobility is not predetermined. It is not guaranteed. It is still competing with petrol cars, hydrogen, biofuel. And you can see, using a socio-technical lens, these barriers aren't only technical. Some of them are financial. EVs still cost a lot. People are concerned about charging. They're concerned about warranties. They're concerned about batteries. They're concerned about recycling. Some of them are environmental. They're concerned about how they're charged, air pollution patterns, things like building roads. And they're concerned with behavior. Whether an EV is considered masculine, whether it's considered tough. One of the biggest issues, as we'll see, are that they don't make noise in the same way that a motorcycle does or a sports car does. And men are concerned that they won't be able to attract women if they drive around in a quiet car, right? So it's really neat in that you kind of need a holistic systems perspective, or you miss different categories of barriers. And in our work, very inductively, One of the first questions we asked in our interviews to get people warmed up was, what are the challenges that the Nordic countries face for both electricity and transport? And again, this gets to be quite a long list. So we identified 40 challenges that our experts said these electricity grids were facing. At the same time, they had 44 transport challenges. So you add this up, you have 84 distinct challenges at the nexus of integrating electricity and transport. In this, you have the role of dealers. And I mentioned earlier the study we did on dealers. They do prove to be, as maybe you would have suspected, a major barrier of sales, right? And in this article, the article is literally called Dismissive and Deceptive Car Dealerships Create Barriers to EVs. You can see here, we did all these visits. The frequency counts show you how much it comes up. So in almost a quarter of the visits, right, dealers are entirely dismissive of EVs. Doesn't make sense, they say. Or this one, do not buy this EV, it will ruin you financially. And other sorts of tactics too, like we would go in and say, oh, we saw there's an EV on the lot, can we take a look at it? Oh no, we don't have any EVs. And yet we saw it. Or we ask for warranty information on the EVs. They say they don't have it, but it's there on the counter, things like that. And the reason for this is actually quite intuitive. Car sales techniques take longer to sell an EV because people have more questions. They want more test drives. They have more difficult questions that maybe the salesperson doesn't have the expertise to answer. So from them, they're trying to sell as many cars as quickly as they can. But it takes 2 to 3 times as long to sell an EV. So they want you out the door. They want the next customer to come in that they can sell an internal combustion car to. And at the level of the franchise, dealerships have kind of become like petrol stations. Petrol stations don't make their most money off of the sale of petrol. They make their money off of the sale of food and candy and soda and beer. So dealerships now make most of their money not on vehicle sales, but on maintenance. And it turns out that EVs require far less maintenance and cut revenues for maintenance from about 60% at some dealers. So you have a double disincentive, a double disincentive to sell it, a disincentive to maintain it, and to cut into revenue that the franchise dealerships need. And that's probably why here we simulated, based on our visits, how likely we would have been if we were really there to buy a car to purchase EVs. And you can see in 2/3 of the visits, we would be very unlikely to unlikely. And this sample is very much heavily weighted towards the Nordic, towards Norway. Because you can see here, most of the positive experiences were in Oslo. When you get out of that, it drops. And in some of the dealerships, especially Denmark, look at Copenhagen and Aarhus, 0. Not a single visit did we think would have resulted in an actual sale if we were there to buy a car. Second lesson, other than the fact that there are some big barriers, are as much as we thought that EVs and V2G and VGI coexisted well and they have synergies and symbiosis, they're not the same. And in fact, you'll need different policy architecture and even different socio-technical architecture to support them. And so what you can see here are all of our EV suggestions. This comes from our respondents about all the things you would need to support only EVs. Tax breaks, taxes on fossil fuels, reductions in the price, information campaigns, right? Government procurement. But this shows you the V2G policies. And again, they look very different. You got a lot more incentives for DSOs. These are district transmissions operators. You've got things for aggregators, which don't even exist for EVs. Aggregators would be those who pool vehicle fleets together and sell ancillary services. You have a much stronger role on business-to-business contracts. You have a much bigger role on fleets as opposed to individual vehicles. So it really starts to underscore the complexity of you'll need dual policies. You'll need your EV policies, but you'll also need your V2G policies. The third thing I mentioned earlier, and it deals with things like gender. So what you can see here, it just shows you from our survey, 5,067 respondents. Look at the differences in the colors. And so in the upper left, you can see, right, experience with EVs and whether they own an EV is a very differentiated thing by gender. Something like 4 times as many men have experience, and something like 5 times as many men actually own an EV, usually a Tesla. You see similar differentiations for education, right? As you become more educated, you're more likely. Household size, maybe because you need to have a car more. Occupationally as well, you can see it's mostly nonprofits and private sector people who own them, not so many who are unemployed or students. And in age, it's really a clustering around middle age, people who are 25 to 55. So this really does suggest that kind of adoption is uniform, and they will of course be determined and shaped by demographics. And this is where gender comes up, and I don't know what I think about these quotes. I'm still shocked they came out in our focus groups and interviews, because remember, this was a research project. This wasn't like we were using people's diaries. They knew they were being recorded when they made these statements, but these came out of our material. So if EVs have a very big advantage, it's the dick factor. If you want to go with the blonde, you want to go with a car with acceleration. So here's an argument that EVs will help you attract a mate. Or here is the other way. When you go with Tesla, it's like how they used to say when you go black, you never go back. When you go Tesla, it's the same thing. It's a totally different car. Let's be honest though, if it's not a Tesla, it's worthless. It looks like a fucking dustbin. It looks like a plastic can on wheels. Where is the dick factor in that one, you know? I mean, if you put your ass in a buddy is a Norwegian EV. It looks like a Lego car. You immediately look 80 years old. I'd be relegated to a sexless life for sure if I bought one. Forget about it. So already you can start to see these notions of masculinity and femininity become very much attached, right, to these vehicles. And again, we were kind of shocked that people use profanity or the word dick factor twice. And these are not the same respondent in our interview. So it also tells you how much it may evoke these emotions, even more in non-research situations, when it's just people at a pub or people around a dinner table. Men usually report greater usage rates for EVs, right? Greater chances of ownership, and a statistically significant difference, right, in terms of adoption patterns. Women, though, report higher levels of awareness and tend to prioritize things like safety or convenience or handbag space, which came out of our material, especially when they're driving family cars. Women also attach less importance to things like speed or power or sound, whereas men conversely prioritize those things. What's interesting too is we had a whole section on V2G in the survey, and there's almost no difference in terms of gender. So it was one of the few areas that was almost gender neutral. We have a slight association that I think men prefer it to women, but it was not statistically significant. The fourth one is a more positive finding, and that is if you are able to overcome those barriers and you are able to kind of align those gender norms, then the co-benefits of vehicle-to-grid adoption can be significant. And this is the work that Lance did, because he was our engineer and our optimization modeler, and he put together a pretty sophisticated model. It was so sophisticated we didn't run it for the 5 Nordic countries. We only did it for Denmark. And that's because you can see here on the left, we ran hourly simulations out to 2030 and 2050, and we tested a whole host of variables and scenarios. 3 different ranges of EV penetration, and we had to really look at a whole confluence of data, including total vehicle stock, battery cost, willingness to pay, diesel cost, diesel efficiency, electricity cost, electricity efficiency, and power plant costs. All of that went into our data set. And then we monitored it all the way out to 2030, and you can see the results here, which shows you what an optimal vehicle-to-grid architecture would look like. And really, it's just, this is the kind of key finding. If Denmark were to have pursued vehicle-to-grid, and they were to have gotten 75% to adopt it, there would be a $34 billion gain, mostly because you're displacing carbon and air pollution. And in Denmark, this is a lot. Denmark's not a very big country, so $34 billion is a lot of money. Denmark is the size of the state of Maryland. It's got 4 million people. So this also works out to about $1,200 per vehicle. And that's not bad, right? You figure after 20 years, the vehicle might pay for itself if its battery is still working. So a not negligible amount of savings, right? This works into, and we were only looking at a few positive externalities like air pollution and climate. We weren't looking at things like jobs, security, reduced volatility to fuel shocks, quieter neighborhoods, and so on, less wear and tear on roads. So there could be a whole host of other benefits we didn't even capture. Some of those benefits would probably be hard to monetize. So this came out of our qualitative work, where I've circled here in red just some of the things that I thought were kind of fascinating when we asked people, what do you value when you think about EVs and V2G? And look at this, no noise. And this gets into tricky questions like, how much is quietness worth, right? Or I like this middle one, guilt-free driving. How much does that value? Or increased visibility, that people feel like they're environmental stewards, right, when they drive an EV. One said it was like they were glowing green when they drove around in their EV because that's how they felt. Or freedom. This is meant to be freedom from oil companies, freedom from the pump, where you can just get your own electricity. And if you have solar or wind, you can even make that electricity yourself and be entirely self-sufficient. The final point is really that justice and equity issues matter. So we did a study looking at energy justice and equity, looking at kind of 4 strands of justice dimensions. And this matches on to very old standing debates in justice literature. So distributive justice is kind of about costs and benefits. Procedural justice is about planning and free prior informed consent and due process. Cosmopolitan justice is about kind of human rights. And recognitional justice is about vulnerable groups, especially underrepresented groups. It's sometimes called the injustice of misrecognition. So things like indigenous groups or the homeless. And what you can see here is we found energy injustices occur for EVs and V2G at all of these phases, right? So in terms of distributive justice, right, most people don't fairly access an EV. It tends to be people higher income, higher education, middle class with their jobs. The unemployed don't have EVs. When we talk about procedural justice, many people talked about the kind of unfairness in policies and regulations. And I'll give you an example here. In our material, someone said a single subsidy given by the government to a Tesla Model S owner had the equivalent value of 30,000 bus tickets. So there's an example of a government subsidy benefiting one individual's automobility when it could have benefited 30,000 bus tickets. Human rights issues get into things like, where did the vehicles go? And I'll show you an image of that in a second, when they leave the Nordic region, because all of these conventional cars don't just disappear. They get exported or resold in Russian markets, Eastern European markets, or African markets. And recognitional justice issues get into things like impacts on minorities. This would be things like road building through indigenous territories, especially lands of the Sami, or things like cobalt mining and how you depend on child labor to provide cobalt that goes into a lot of the electric vehicle batteries. And again, this showcases 2 of those externalities. On the left, these are European cars that are fossil fueled that have left the Nordic market and are now being sold in Ghana. And on the right, you see a young Congolese cobalt miner who spends 20 hours a day inside a mine, mining by hand. He doesn't even have a shovel or a ladder to provide resources and material inputs into the supply chain for Volkswagen and other EV manufacturers. So what does this mean? I mean, I think you've got 5 conclusions. I think aggressive, so the first one, right, going back to my first lesson, aggressive and additional policy support is needed. You got to have policies that are loud, long, and legal and are continuous, even in the Nordic region. So the Nordic transition to EVs is not guaranteed. It is contingent on further policy support, especially in overcoming some of those barriers that I mentioned. Remember, all 84 of them, which cut across the domain of electricity and transport. We need policy mixes, and those policy mixes are going to differ. And whether you want EVs and or V2G depends on different policy mixes. You'll need both if you want both. EV adoption is strongly shaped and mediated by demographics. The big three, income, education, and gender, and some of the qualitative data on gender and the masculinization of vehicles is also very interesting, and it may be difficult for EVs to replicate. The co-benefits, if we do decarbonize transport, are vast. We only looked at Denmark, which was one of the smallest of the Nordic states. They may be even vaster for countries like Norway, and certainly vaster for countries like China or the United States, even though you can't monetize many of them, like guilt-free driving or noiseless driving. Those that you can, air pollution and climate change, are serious. And those that others could model, jobs and security and improved dependence and skills, could also only extend those types of benefits. And then finally, I think we do need to remain aware that EVs and vehicle to grid exist within a political economy. And that political economy involves global supply chains and capital. And that capital is focused on making them cheap. And because it's focused on making them cheap, you do have a connection between EVs and things like labor exploitation and extractive regimes in places like the Congo or South America, which are degrading local communities and threatening local livelihoods. So from the whole system, we might be decarbonizing Nordic transport, but only by making other regions of the world less clean and more dangerous. And I think that requires us to look more carefully at the ethics of electric mobility and how we hold particular companies and supply chains accountable. And with that, I'm very happy for people to write to me later on if you have any questions or you want any of the plethora of studies that I shared. But more importantly, I'm happy to turn it back to Helen and to start thinking through some of your questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I found that absolutely fascinating. So I would encourage everybody who's online to put your questions into the Q&A box. I've got a couple that I'm really excited to ask, and so I will start with one of mine while we wait for everybody to have an opportunity to type their questions into the Q&A box. The first question I wanted to ask, when you talk about the mystery shoppers, it's something that I've been thinking about in my own work, connecting that idea of mystery shoppers with gender. And part of what triggered that for me was that one of the participants in some of my research, when asked, I presented some of your findings and some of other people's findings to participants and said, why do you think EV use is so gendered? And one of my participants said to me, whenever I go into EV sales rooms, I'm completely ignored in comparison to the men who go in, and I have been treated like I'm a cat that's been dragged in off the street. People don't expect me to understand the technology, and they ignore me and they don't try to sell me an EV. So I was just wondering what gender your mystery shoppers were and whether you noticed any of that.
Yeah, and we actually, we manipulated it a bit too to our advantage. So first of all, the ethics of mystery shopping are a bit weird because you want to be, right, we wanted to be quick. We didn't want to take too much time. And because we had no real intention of buying a vehicle, in a way, we were definitely wasting their time. And for those, those most precarious car salesmen, they only get paid on commission. And so literally we were stopping them from selling a car as long as they were talking to us. So we did design our mystery shopping to be short, less than 20 minutes. And we never did test drives, even though our team kind of wanted to. We didn't, it was kind of going too far. So we only took 20 minutes of their time. And at the end, we did give them a certificate to Amazon or Starbucks, their choice. So it was kind of a little something for 30 euros to offset the cost. But we had a team of mystery shoppers, a mix of women and men. And our strategy was also to go in a mix of different attire. And so we always had someone go in a suit who dressed up. And it's like you said, Helen, they got everyone's attention. Always. Sometimes multiple salesperson would come to try to speak to the person in the suit. We had another team who was always a couple and always dressed in jeans. They were obviously much less visible. And we even thought about trying to do a study that talked about the kind of systematic comparison between how we dressed and all that. But one of our researchers got sick and wasn't there for half of the visit, so we couldn't. And besides, it probably wasn't a big enough sample size. But that was, the team was always those three people in different configurations going. We only changed who had to wear the suit.
Right. That is fascinating. It's something that I think it would be Yeah, really interesting to follow up on. I'm keeping an eye on the question and answer box. We don't have anything yet, so I would really encourage anybody, if you do have any questions, now is a great time to ask them. But I have another question. I think I could,
Sure.
I think we could carry on this for ages, but I would encourage other people to have their say also. Now, you talked a little bit about freedom, and I'm aware that automobility is often constructed in this sense of freedom. And I've seen several commentaries that suggest EVs kind of erode a freedom of automobility through things like having to stop to charge and potentially having to divert from a route because of the spatial distribution of chargers. But I've also come across several things that talk about this, the idea of freedom from visiting petrol stations and freedom from environmental guilt. What I haven't seen is a great deal that talks about how issues around V2G might influence our social understanding of the freedom and mobility associated with vehicles if vehicles become part of an energy system as well as a mobility system. I wondered if you'd thought about that.
Yeah, I think you probably see the same dualistic notion of freedom, and also I've seen good work that talks about freedom from, freedom to, freedom over. So there's different kind of ways of thinking through freedom. But just to take two examples, I could see vehicle to grid as perceived as lessening freedom because your car is not available when you need it, or the battery's getting worn down, right? The car is not as good, it's more used, the more cycles that it goes through. Especially too, if you're doing a V2G market that is using your vehicle for more than just grid services, especially for things like peak power, well, that is going to drain your battery, and you're contractually obligated to a utility to provide that peak power. So if your partner has to go to the hospital, you can't use your car, or you face getting fines. So I could see those types of things kind of really irritating consumers and slowing adoption. At the same time, you could flip the narrative around and kind of a vehicle that pays you, a vehicle that actually, when it's not doing anything, gives you money, and not just insignificant money, 30, 40, 50 euros a week. Like, hey, what's not to, and think of the free, that's my vacation money. That's my steak money. That's my coffee money, or whatever it is that you want to treat yourself to. Or that's my money to give and donate to a charity to make me feel good. So it frees you from petroleum. So I could kind of see both of those things going both ways. And that material, and our respondents did also pick up on these tensions where some of them were like, V2G, I don't know if I like the idea of someone controlling my car. And others who were like, yeah, when can I sign up? I need the money.
Mm. Fantastic, thank you. Now we've had a couple of questions coming in. We've got a couple of people asking if we can have links to research and also copies of the slides. We will be sharing the video of this recording later, so look out for that. And there are lots of details of some of the papers in the presentation. But I know that Benjamin has also reported that he would be happy to share things with people also. So for those questions, do get in touch if you want something other than the recording of the webinar. We've also got another question come in saying, how could V2G be brought into using smart government policy incentives?
Yeah, so this is a good question. We looked at it a little bit differently in terms of like potential for business markets, and we identified like 11 different business markets for V2G. And this is a bit weird because it's like you would think that the big two would be selling the vehicle, and that is one, as well as selling grid services, and that also is one. So those are two of the biggest spaces that V2G has the potential to both provide mobility services and generate revenue. But there are a whole bunch of other ones too, like integration with mobility as a service plans, or secondhand markets for batteries, or markets for software and data protection. And so I think the kind of cascading business models for V2G can become quite broad. And I think if I had to just pick one, so if I were to design smart government incentives, you don't start with individuals and their vehicles. I think you start with fleets, especially because fleets get you greater resources. You wouldn't necessarily need an aggregator, as in the fleet itself would be aggregated enough. It has enough vehicles to provide what you want. And there are huge potential fleet options: school buses, municipal vehicles, police vehicles, right? Where there are like hundreds of cars that are idle, or even rental car companies at the airport, which have their fleet sitting there in the middle of the night when no one's there. So I think that might be an ability to get millions of vehicles in immediately by only dealing with a few thousand actors. rather than having to enroll millions and millions and millions of people. So I really think this notion of fleets and aggregation is probably the best single place to start if you're looking for smart policy.
Excellent. That's an interesting thought. Brilliant. We have another question coming from Greg. I think it's an interesting question. Did your work touch on the capacity of the manufacturing sector to supply enough EVs? Currently, the expected demand for EVs cannot be met by battery production to fit into EVs.
No, and that's largely because, I mean, we were really looking at V2G enabled EVs, and they were very few. And back when we did this study, there was only one manufacturer, Nissan, who provided a VGI capable one. And so in a way it was, and by the way, they had enough vehicles. There was no shortage in the Nordic region for those. There were shortages at times of Teslas and Zoes and e-Golfs and a few others every now and then, but never the Nissan Leaf. So in that regard, it didn't really come up. But we did do some studies on business models, and we did note that some of the business models did fail. So they didn't fail in terms of selling OEM cars, but they did fail in terms of selling batteries or charging infrastructure. Those markets were very, very vulnerable. And so in those situations, when those companies went under, there were an inability of charge points, and there were an inability of batteries. So there were other parts of the supply chain that tended to be constrained, but not vehicle sales.
That's really interesting because I have heard it said we have a now annual, we had our inaugural EVs and Beyond conference last year, and I did hear several people say that one of the big challenges in New Zealand is actually getting enough vehicles into the country to meet the demand that there is currently, and that is, of course, expected to grow. So it's interesting that you didn't find that in your
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably not just that we're a different region. Remember, in the Nordic region too, not everyone has cars because they're so expensive. The tax on a car is like as much as the car. So already you're dealing with a niche market. Most people actually use trains or buses, which I'm sure is a little bit different than New Zealand. And then it's just time. I mean, I'm sure there are delays now, but we did this in 2016 and 2017. So like way back then, there wasn't really much of a delay.
That actually brings me on to another. We have got another one, but I'm going to sneak in and ask another of mine because I think it's connected to that. I was just wondering how equitable EV ownership is in those Nordic countries, particularly Norway, where the rates of adoption of EVs are so much higher than they would be somewhere like New Zealand. How equitable is that?
Not very. And we talk about this a lot too. It's certainly upper middle class and middle class families. There was a huge tendency as well for EVs to be a second car or a third car or a fourth car. So you can kind of see it's just really wealthy families with collections of cars. And even then, the uptakes were usually by single occupants and often men. So it wasn't like it was being used as a family car, or if it was, it was a family car that was only used on the weekends because the man was using it throughout the week to get to his job. So yeah, so I think those attributes came out a bit of our material.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so from Richard here, we've got, it's hard to pilot V2G in New Zealand when vehicle suppliers seem reluctant to engage. If we can overcome this, what sort of pricing entices EV owners to engage? E.g., what are the relative prices to buy electricity and sell electricity?
Yeah, I mean, EVs are expensive. They still are much more capital expensive. I mean, back when we did our research, it was like the EV version of a car was 8,000 euros higher than the non-EV version. And I might be even more now because EVs have gotten better with better range and then more expensive. V2G adds a little bit more. So I think to get a V2G capable one adds another 2,000 or 3,000 on top of that. And then you still have to get your charger or your V2G connector for the home, which is another 1,000. So you've got like all these extra costs, and then you add on VAT, tax, et cetera. It's even more. So I'm not surprised that there were so few actual V2G adopters. For EV, I think the three big concerns that consumers tend to have about cost is depreciation of the vehicle, especially the battery, because they're worried if the battery goes, do I have to pay another 20,000 euros for a new car? Can they charge, right? Are there going to be enough charge points? And what do I do for long distances, right, that are just out of the range? The first thing you can address, and they have started to address, is better warranties. So now, most of the time, if you do buy an EV, it's 2 years old, the battery goes, you get a new one for free because it's included in the warranty. Second one of charge points is a bit more difficult. because there are a lot of regulations about charging. Like for in the US is a really weird place because you violate a lot of laws if you start to sell electricity and you're not a utility. So they've done really weird things like, here's a parking spot. It's free electricity. We're not charging you for the electricity. We're going to charge you for the parking spot. So they're kind of reverse charging you to get around those types of intricacies. But I think those types of availability of charge points is an important barrier. And then the final one for range, BMW did this. If you buy the i3 or the i8, included in your package is a mobility as a service plan where you get the use of a conventional car up to like 10 times when you need it. So if you do want to take that long drive to Poland, wherever it is in Germany they go, then you can just drop your EV off at the dealership, they loan you a car, and then you return it after the weekend's gone. So it helps eliminate that notion of range. You can't use EVs. So I think we're starting to see solutions to these types of barriers, and all of them try to take these kind of cost things and show you the value that you're getting. But I think on a well-to-wheels metric or a kilometers traveled metric, or the one that I like, TCO, total cost of ownership metric, EVs are still going to be a bit more expensive than non-EVs, as long as we're not pricing carbon emissions and other externalities from transport.
Okay, I think following on from that, perhaps, and connecting with notions of mobility as a service and also potential other policies. We've got a question here saying, appreciate the statement about EV subsidies equating to 30,000 bus tickets. What policies can encourage EV uptake for lower socioeconomic persons? And I think I would perhaps add, or should we be encouraging that uptake? What should we be doing in that context?
Yeah, one of the criticisms of EV policy in Norway at that time was why EVs and why not even other forms of e-mobility, like micromobility, like scooters and bikes, right? Dockless bike sharing schemes, e-bikes, e-scooters, which were excluded. So it really did embed, it's like, here's an incentive for automobiles, but not everything else that you might use for mobility. Had they done that, a lot of those other elements, especially e-bikes and e-scooters, aren't that expensive. And if you're doing e-bike sharing, it's fee for service. You spend $3 on it. So it could even be cheaper than a bus ticket. So I think a lot of those options would have helped meet income and mobility needs of lower income people. I think the other one then would just be cross subsidies. We've seen this in a lot of successful energy access programs where like you charge wealthy consumers excess and funnel the difference back into pro-poor programs. And so you could have done, maybe the EV incentive should have been even costlier, and then 10,000 of those euros goes into a fund that helps rehabilitate mass transit or that focuses on EV car sharing at social housing blocks. So there are ways of redistributing some of the revenues from EV prices to go into those things.
Excellent, thank you. And probably following on from the e-bikes and the e-scooters, have you seen two-wheeler using with V2G technology?
No, maybe I think because the batteries are smaller, there might not be enough capacity. But again, I mean, I've seen thousands of these scooters around cities, so maybe it would add up to a simple, big enough amount of capacity. And still, I know that some EVs are actually pretty small. So already you can see your biggest scooters maybe approaching the batteries of some of the smallest cars. But I think it's an intriguing idea worth looking into. I do know that buses and trains are seen as very big markets for V2G because the batteries are just so huge. But you'd have to aggregate scooters.
Excellent, thank you. All right, great topic. Thanks a lot, says an anonymous attendee. V2G is useful when we ignore the timing of the demand for each, the vehicle and the grid. In most cases, they will come together. It's like accepting for someone to empty your fuel tank and refuel it again during the day. That affects the own vehicle availability. So I could have less than a quarter tank when I might need to use my vehicle urgently. How do you address such an issue? So I think that comes back to that point you made about suddenly potentially needing to take someone to hospital or something.
So, I mean, you can handle this in a few ways. Smart charging is usually what everyone talks about. So you would have restrictions on charging or an inability to charge right throughout the day. And usually what they say is you're charging your vehicle at night, and then during the day you're charging it either at a public charge point or at work, right? So you would complement public infrastructure and private infrastructure together. But two other things that are quite interesting. One, and I thought this is such an intuitive solution, battery swapping. You have a pre-charged, readily available battery that you can just swap in for those few times that you might, right, have to travel. And you could buy used batteries or other batteries, so you don't have to put up all the thousands of euros for a potentially brand new battery. There are even e-swapping companies that could just guarantee you that service, so you don't even have to buy the battery, you can just rent it. And then the other thing that's quite neat, I've seen some of the load profiles for charging, and if you're using V2G for like peak power, then you're going to drain your battery. But actually, the most profitable thing that most people need, and remember at night, usually you have no peak power needs anyway. Peak power is during the day. Usually what you need to do is only provide grid services, especially things like reactive power, which aren't really a huge load on the battery. It's like small bursts, right? And if there's a big enough fleet, they're not tapping your vehicle that much anyway. They're tapping 100 vehicles in a rotating cycle. And I've seen that it's very possible that a car, while it charges overnight, fully meets its V2G grid services role, and in the morning, it's a full charge because you're not depleting that much of the battery. And these types of markets for ancillary services and grid services are still profitable. Like it's not like 5 cents. You're still getting, 50 to 60 euros per week, hundreds of euros per month, up to 1,000 or more euros per year just for that. So it's a nice way of like, you're not really intensively degrading the battery. It's just a little bit to help provide these grid services. And I think that's probably why we thought grid services was the best single market for V2G, because it gets around this pesky issue of draining people's batteries.
All right, brilliant. Thank you. We're going to go for one more question, and then I know that the Professor Sovacool has to leave us. So, last question. Did you critique the state of standards, especially V2G? Are the standards fit for purpose and ready to be deployed? Also, did you investigate scenarios for how energy transfer was arbitrated?
No to the second on energy transfer. To the first, we didn't critique standards. What we did, though, is we looked at, so there's an approach in science technology studies called co-production. Sheila Jasanoff is the one who talks about it. And the argument is that standards are co-created around values. And there's a lot of social stuff that gets built into the standard. And so what we did in our standards article is we looked at cultural variation on how these standards were interpreted, which is in a way critiquing because we're showing deviation across the different regimes. And what was really interesting is we looked at one standard, right, the ISO standard for EVSE, and we found basically at a very high level, the Europeans obeyed it. The Americans tried to modify it, and the Chinese ignored it. And so there's kind of three very different regimes. So it also shows you that really that standard's only being tediously followed in some parts of the world. In the US, they were trying to do a rival standard. I haven't followed what happened with it. And in China, they basically didn't care at all and just kind of did their Chinese thing. So I guess this also shows you the pitfalls of these types of standards, and that even global ISO standards, are implemented very differently in different contexts, given different political and social priorities.
All right, brilliant. Thank you very much. I think that's fascinating. And there's lots of stuff in there that I think there's potential to do lots more explorations of all the fascinating issues that are being raised. But in the interest of time, I'd like to finish by saying a big thank you to all of you here today for attending today's session. I've learned heaps, and there's lots that I really do want to follow up on. There's a whole plethora of new things to think about, and I hope that's the same for all the other attendees too. For details of future events, don't forget to visit itsnz.org. But for, of course, our most important thank you to Professor Sovacool, thank you, and thank you again for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure. And to everybody, go well, ka kite anō, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.